The Deluge, this is where I basically show, I correlate the legends, because of all the legends, and there's lots of legends and myths, the most ubiquitous of all the legends is the Great Deluge. We find it in, obviously the Judeo-Christian tradition, but we find it in the Sumerians, the Chaldeans, we find it in the Egyptians, we find it from the ancient Celts, we find it embedded in the Norse traditions, we find it in the Mayans, the Aztecs, we find it in the Polynesian Islanders, we find it from the Indians that live at the Tierra del Fuego at the tip of South America. It's in the Eskimo traditions. It's embedded in over 100 known North American Indian tribes traditions. The Japanese, ancient Japanese have a tradition. It's the ancient Siberians, on and on. It is the most prevalent of all the ancient myths. And for that reason, I feel that it deserves some extra attention. So I've actually devoted a whole couple of programs to really deciphering and trying to understand what really did happen, and then getting into what in the world, because I don't accept the supernatural cause. I mean, interestingly, geologists don't go here, most of them. There's a few. The tide is beginning to turn. Most geologists think of this, this goes back to the old days when, the Bible people were battling the science people, back in the 17 and early 1800s, and finally, science won out, and things like Noah's flood and all that got relegated to the shelf where they felt like it belongs. And anybody who dredged up ideas of great floods or great catastrophes was trying to drag science back to the Middle Ages. Well, as you're going to see, the scientific evidence now does confirm that there really was a great flood. Basically, this flood is the dividing line of human history as I see it. How many of you know how old the oldest modern humans are now dated at? But if you look at what the scientists are saying, the anthropologists, they're saying typically around 100. Some of the more daring ones are going to 150, yes. But you think of it, if there were modern humans, just like we who are now in this room, walking around on this earth 100 or 120,000 years ago, and our recorded history essentially begins 5 or 6 or 7,000 years ago maximum, what was going on during all of that previous period? Well, a conventional scholarly explanation is basically this, which I think is completely fanciful idea, the caveman, dragging his spouse by her hair in one hand and his club in the other hand. And I think that's actually silly. Do I think that people lived in caves? Yes. Do I think people took shelter in caves from certain things that were happening in the environment around them? Absolutely I do. Do I think that this model of cavemen living generation after generation after generation without ever actually figuring anything out beyond, how to go out and club a woolly mammoth, which is pretty much the conventional depiction? No, what I'm getting at is that I believe very strongly that about minimum 90 to 95% of human history has been lost, almost completely lost. And what we have very little physical evidence of what our ancestors were doing for all those lost tens of thousands of years. However, what we do have is the myths and the legends that can give us an idea. And that's ultimately where myth and legend has its roots, is back in the antediluvian world, the world that existed before the last great global upheaval, of which the deluge was the consequence. The breaking of the world is where I get into the pole shift theories, the tectonic changes and so forth, the evidence for pole change, basically which we see in orogenic effects, which means which means mountains, the mountain ranges of the world. Basically, most of the mountain ranges, in my opinion, were not built very slowly, they were built very quickly. If you go to the Canadian Rockies, you can see overthrust faults, for example, that are as broken and sharp and fresh as if they were upthrust yesterday. And if you accept the plate tectonics model, it suggests that mountains are uplifted at a rate of perhaps a few millimeters per year as a result of continental drift, as a result of seafloor spreading. However, the geologists that study erosion rates, if you read their accounts, their accounts suggest that basically the rate at which land is worn away is as faster than it should be uplifted. That being the case, how do you explain the existence of a mountain? You know, if a mountain is being worn away as fast or faster than the plates that are spreading. See, mountains are supposed to be buckled up, which I believe they are. They're buckled up by two plates, tectonic plates colliding with one another. However, if we accept the current rates, that's happening very slowly. So the uplift rate is going to be equaled or exceeded by the wearing down rate. But that is not what you see. So I get into a lot of that in dealing with pole shifts and those kind of theories in this particular program. Here's where I basically analyze the apocalyptic traditions from all the ancient literature that I've been able to find. I primarily focus on the Judeo-Christian tradition because that's what most people are familiar with. But having looked at some of this other stuff, then I relate that, you know, this deals a lot with prophecy. Because I believe that basically what the apocalypse is describing, it's describing what is to come because it's describing a rhythm, a cycle that has been ongoing for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. And so when you're reading these apocalyptic descriptions, you're not only reading projections of what could happen, but you're reading accounts of what has happened before. Ekpyrosis is a subheading of the apocalyptic stuff. In Ekpyrosis, that's the Greek term that was used to talk about, you know, as Plato talked about and many other ancient authors, the world is periodically destroyed by the two great agencies of water and fire. And actually they're related. Fire was involved. First there was fire. The fire made the deluge possible, okay? In here I get into the myths of fire, the stories of fire. I get into what the Hopis said about it, the Aztecs, the Mayans, biblical stuff. And then I get into what science has shown. And then I draw on some modern examples of what I think are microcosmic examples of what was going on here. For example, we might talk about the Great Chicago Fire and some of the very strange phenomena that were associated with that. And the fact that the greatest urban fire in American history broke out at precisely within minutes of the same time that the greatest forest fire in American history occurred. And both of them are accompanied by extremely strange, inexplicable phenomena. And I believe this is in effect the cosmos giving us lessons by which we can understand the bigger picture. And so in this, I kind of get into that. Like we talk about the Peshtigo fire. I went and visited there about 6 years ago and when I was working on the documentary Fire from the Sky, this was a major component of that. So we went to Peshtigo and to interview people who were descendants of survivors who went to the museum and got accounts that had never been published before of some of the extraordinary phenomena associated with that event. So that's in this particular one. I have a whole section devoted to the Mesoamerican mysteries because I believe that they were really on to something. I mean, their knowledge of Earth change is quite profound. It ties in very much with a lot of the other things. So I've got one devoted, it deals with their architecture, with their symbology. We analyze some of the codices and some of the information that's embedded in there. Plato's Atlantis is essentially almost a line-by-line analysis of Plato. Now, there's been so much stuff written about Atlantis, in my opinion, most of it fanciful. If you want to get to the crux of any Atlantean tradition, you've got to go back to Plato, because without Plato and his writings, there wouldn't have been Atlantis, basically. I believe there was a tradition. I believe he was setting down an actual tradition as he heard it. He makes that clear in his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, where the account of Atlantis occurs. 3 times he makes the statement that this is real history, but all of those who are the followers of Aristotle, who was Plato's rival, basically rejected that notion and said that Plato just conjured it up as a metaphor for his ideal model of the perfect state. But what the crux of it gets down to, does it hold up? Can you verify the specific details that he gives? He gives details of timing, he gives details of geography. In the 1960s and early 70s, with the rise of plate tectonics, there was a group of geologists that worked for the U.S. Geological Survey who got together and wrote a tome called Atlantis Fact or Fiction. What they ostensibly set out to do in that book was to basically debunk Atlantis once and for all. The claim that they made was that now that we have modern plate tectonics and we understand the Earth in the context of plate tectonics, we can say unequivocally that there couldn't have existed an Atlantis. What you see is before that, most of the Atlantean accounts and researchers into Atlantis were following the clues as Plato set them out, his geographical clues, his timing, and so forth. Post-publication of that book, what you see is people start looking all kinds of other places. You know, now we have Akrotiri, we have Crete, we have Troy, we have the Atlas Mountains in Morocco, we have Cuba, even Antarctica. Now, Antarctica is another story. I don't believe Antarctica was the location of Atlantis. It may have been the location of something, but it's so far removed from Plato's geography that I don't see why we would call it Atlantis. Although I think that the true story of Antarctica has yet to be told. There's, you know, because I think there's definitely surprises waiting for us under the Antarctic ice cap. So anyways, in this thing, what I do is I go in and I go back to a lot of Plato's original Greek words and so forth, the language that he used, and I get into his geography and his historiography, and we analyze the details, and then we look at maps. We look at, I've got some of the most detailed marine maps of bathymetric chart maps of the ocean bottom that have been that are available to the general public. There are more detailed ones that have been done by the Navy, because I believe that probably in those maps is in those unpublished or non-declassified maps is the information to pinpoint the exact location, because there are sunken land masses in the mid-Atlantic. Okay, I get into that in this particular program. In Arcanum, that's where I get into a lot of things that are just sort of almost eclectic, but basically things that had no other category to go in, but are just really intense and interesting things that I think are probably not known by a lot of people at large. Lunar Mysteries is a very interesting one, because the moon, as Harold C. Urey said, the famous Nobel Prize winning physicist said back as some of the results of the Apollo program started coming in, I think he said it in the early 70s, he said the existence of the moon, the non-existence of the moon is easier to explain than its existence. And this is sort of why I get into here what he was actually talking about there. So I correlate ancient traditions about the moon with modern post-Apollo traditions. Some of the really bizarre things of the moon haven't necessarily been suppressed, but they've been totally ignored. Some of you may be familiar with some of that, but that's what I get into here.
I believe it might be hollow. You know, when they drop things on it to run like a bell. There's all sorts of amazing things on the moon. It's way too large for our planet. So you look at proportional. Anyway, here we are.
Well, yeah, that's what she said is actually correct. Seismometers set on the moon were one of the things that yielded this very anomalous data. They set up seismographs on the moon and then watched what happened when lunar landers crashed into the moon or small meteoroids hit the moon, and then analyzed that data. And that's just one little piece of the whole scenario. The cosmic Grail, this I'm not going to even talk about now. This is kind of, I get into this sort of at the end of the whole thing. If we ever get there, this is something I have never yet even taught to anybody. Only because we've never gotten through to the end of the program, and that's where I put it. And essentially, I think that it takes some of the information that I present in. There's bits and pieces of this in everything that precedes it, and in this one, I put it all together. And what we do in this one is we go back to essentially an analysis of the Grail legends from the Middle Ages. Robert de Boron, Crescent de Troyes, Wolfram von Eschenbach, and so forth. So if you're interested in this at all, I mean, I don't know how many of you ever read any of the Grail romances, but this is, I've pretty much tried to read them all, and then follow the clues, because the Grail romances each emphasize different clues, and if you follow those clues, it's gonna lead you on this journey. And then America's Occult History and Cosmic Destiny. There is an occult history to the founding of America, which I think needs to be told. And having followed through this study of sacred geometry and ancient traditions, I think puts one in a rather privileged position of being able to really understand what some of the esoterica involved in the founding of our country was. And I think it's very important to reconnect with some of that, because there's an original vision that has essentially been forgotten. And that's what this one's about. The Holy City is kind of the last thing where basically, with all this information and dealing with death and destruction and catastrophe and so forth, I don't want people to think that it's all just gloom and doom, but because out of there, like if you read the book of Revelations, after all of these tremendous cosmic events have occurred, then suddenly there's a new heaven and a new earth, and a new harmony that emerges in the new earth, in the new heaven and the new earth. And so this is the last thing I do. Basically, this deals with, okay, where are we now, and what do we need to do? What do we as the human species need to be doing? And we can go back for inspiration. We can go back to the cathedral builders. We can go back to the megalithic builders. We can go back to the pyramid builders for inspiration. And essentially what we are doing is reactivating the great work. You know, just as I was talking about, you know, back in the 1100s, the signal went out. All of a sudden they begin, almost like organic things, 80 great stone edifices begin to rise out of the European landscape, embodying this cosmic geometry in resonance with the earth and the sky, linking the earth and the sky. We can go back, you know, 4,500 years ago and find the same thing happening in the Indus Valley, in the Sumerian culture, in the Egyptian culture. The great ziggurats of Sumeria were being built at the same time as the pyramids of Egypt, with the possible exception, I believe, of the Great Pyramid, which I strongly suspect is much, much, much older than Old Kingdom, generally attributed to Second Dynasty of the Old Kingdom. Once again, I think one of those was a period where essentially the signal went out, and these disparate groups of people around the planet began to actually do things to change the vibration of the planet itself, to change its resonance, and ultimately to accelerate the evolution of human consciousness. And I believe that now, as we come to the end of this, what I believe is the end of an age, once again, I think the signal is going out. The whistle is blowing, saying that it's time for the craftsmen to reassemble and once again to pick up where we left off, you know, 600, 800 years ago. And obviously what this work to me is not something that one generation does. It's something that one generation begins and the next generation picks it up and the next generation picks it up after that. And so this is about taking all of this information and essentially saying, okay, now that we know all this, what are we supposed to do? What actions do we take? And that's essentially, this is essentially where we analyze the blueprints for the next phase of human evolution, which I believe involves essentially the creation of a cosmic civilization. The ancient knowledge will again abound and overflow as water upon the earth. The remains of this knowledge are everywhere about us in everyday use and perfect. And hopefully, as the outcome of going through all of this and studying the ancient mythology and the symbology and so forth, you begin to see that there are these traditions all around us. I gave a talk last Wednesday night in which I addressed this a little bit, but there are many, many ways in which these manifest. For example, you just saw the pyramid with the eye, that's the Great Seal of the United States. Well, that's a cosmic symbol set down with the idea of imparting specific insight and information. And it's right there on the back of the dollar bill where everybody can see it, right? But what does it mean? What does it mean to say annuit septis novus ordo seclorum and surround that around this 13-course pyramid with the all-seeing eye of Horus in the triangle? It has a meaning to it. The things that we do, I mean, where the ancient knowledge is embedded, like it says here, it's everywhere about us. We just had Halloween. Halloween is a very, very ancient custom. Our Halloween comes from Samhain, which was a Celtic festival of the dead, but you can go back into the Celts 800 and 1,000 years ago were practicing Samhain. At the same day, at the same time, on the other side of the world, the ancient Peruvians were also observing a Day of the Dead. You go to the Pacific Ocean and the Polynesian Islanders. We're observing on the same day a festival of the dead. Okay, there was a reason all of these people. The Egyptians had a festival of the dead. In the Bible, we're told that in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, in the 17th day of the month, were all the fountains of the great deep broken up and the windows of heaven were opened. This was the event that inaugurated the Great Flood. Well, if you go back to the ancient Hebrew calendar and you realize that it represented the period of Scorpio, and you count the 17 days in, you realize that that event essentially sets it right around the time of Halloween. And astronomically, something very interesting happens then. That's what an astronomer would call the culmination of the Pleiades. And the culmination of the Pleiades means simply this. If you go out in like an open field and you look at the southern horizon, the local meridian, which is the line that passes through in space from the North Pole down to the South Pole, as the Earth turns, the stars rise in the east, arc over through the heavens and set in the west. The highest arc that they attain is called their culmination. If you go out on Halloween night, what you see is that the Pleiades are culminating exactly overhead at midnight. And there was an ancient connection with the Pleiades that was the origin of what has come down to us centuries, if not millennium later, as Halloween. In the Dia dos los Muertos, if I said that right. The what? Dia de los Muertos. Yes, the Day of the Dead. Okay. What happens there is that the depiction of essentially the Pleiades, you can find the Day of the Dead depicted in some of the Mexican codices, like the Borgia Codice contains a depiction of a god who is called Zantamoc. He's falling from the heavens. And surrounding him are star signs, and down to the corner on the picture is the rattlesnake. And to the ancient Mayans, the Pleiades was symbolized by the rattlesnake. And so there's a connection between the Pleiades and our observation on Halloween. And that's kind of that's an example of how I'm citing that because it's, we could go to Christmas, we could go to Easter, so forth. We could go to, the maypole dance. I mean, we could go on and on and on and on with these ancient customs that are still surrounding us that actually have their roots back in these very, very ancient traditions. But again, most people do these things mechanically without realizing that there are levels of meaning and information contained there. And here it is. I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away. This is the idea of the changing of the cycle, the changing of the world ages. It's like I was talking about, if you go back and you look at the actual maps and you realize that in these short little intervals, the map of the earth is essentially redrawn. And then there is a new heaven and a new earth, a new relationship between earth and the sky that takes place.